Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Krylik. I'm the president of the Springfield Township Historical Society, and welcome to our first um, presentation via Zoom. Today is the 28th of May, 2020, and we're going to have two speakers this evening, George McNeely and Dr. Bill Valerio. And George will speak first for 45 minutes or so, followed by Bill with 10 or 15 minutes. And our topic this evening is the Woodmere Art Museum. And George McNeely is an architectural historian, a lecturer, and writer. He earned his BA in art history from Princeton, an MBA from Columbia Business School. He most recently was vice president of the for international affairs at the World Monuments Fund. Prior to joining the World Monuments Fund, he was with Christie's for 15 years as a senior vice president in business development and the chairman's office. He previously worked at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and he regularly speaks around the country and internationally on a variety of topics related to art and architecture, the art market, and the auction business. Dr. Bill Valerio is the Patricia Van Berg Allison Director and CEO of the Woodmere Art Museum. Dr. Valerio has a master's in history of art with a specialization in 17th century artwork. That's from the University of Pennsylvania, and he has his PhD in art history, specializing in European modernism from Yale. He also has an MBA in marketing and strategic management from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. Bill first curated his first exhibit as a graduate student in 1988 and joined the Queens Museum of Art as a curator in 1997. He's former assistant director of administration at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he joined Woodmere Art Museum in September of 2010. So I'm very pleased to welcome both of these gentlemen this evening and all of you for this presentation. So at this point, I'll turn it over to George McNeely. Thank you.
So I think you're going to have to make me the host so I can screen share.
Yes.
Is that right? And then I will put up my slides for everybody to see. So
okay, see. That should be done.
I don't think that worked. There we go. And now I just need to do that. Sorry, roll. And there you go. So for those of you who are seeing this, hang on, if you would like to make our little boxes on the right-hand side as small as possible, if you run your cursor along to the left-hand side of the boxes, between our boxes and the slide, there should be a vertical line that will come up and down. And if you put your cursor on that and drag it to the right, you can make us as little as possible so you can see the screen better. So if everybody's all set up, off we go. So as Scott said, I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so on the history of Woodmere, and then Bill's going to join in and talk about what's going on now, so we can have a nice mixture of things. So let's see what's going on here. There we go. Okay. So here's the outline of the talk. Wait, hang on, I'm just adjusting. There we go. Here's the outline of the talk. I'm going to start by talking about Charles Knox Smith, the founder of Woodmere, and his life and how he ended up doing this. Then Woodmere the house, because it's interesting architecturally. And then the founder's collection. Wait, it's going, hang on, okay, there we go. The Founders Collection, because he had a particularly, although collection is misspelled right there. So anyway, he had a particularly interesting collection, which became the core of the museum. And then I'm going to talk about the famous Orphans Court kit situation in the 1930s when there was issues around transition from being private house to the museum. Then we talk about the museum in the beginning, and then some collection highlights. And then Woodmere today will be Bill. So here we go with Charles Knox Smith. So this is the famous portrait that's there at Woodmere of himself towards the end of his life. This was painted in 1913. He was born in 1845, so before the Civil War, and he died in 1916, a key date to remember. So this was 3 years before he died, by the Philadelphia artist Albert Rosenthal. He's interesting the way he's portrayed here, because he clearly isn't portrayed with his collection around him. He's got that either Chinese or Japanese blanc de Chine figure in his hand. So I'm curious as to why that figure is there. What did that mean to him? But something. And then in the back is one of the famous paintings, Sir Thomas Lawrence, that we'll talk about later. So he chose to be portrayed as a collector amongst his things. He was born in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, of humble origins, and he started his career, or started working life, as a grocer's boy. He had some luck, he worked up, and he moved into the oil business. Now, in 1859 was when the oil was found in Titusville, Pennsylvania. So he at that point was 14. So it happened so he then worked for an oil company, and that it's sort of like the internet boom or something of its moment. So he worked up through that and did quite well. He made his own business, and he was quite successful. But then interestingly, he took a different path right at the end of the 19th century. And this is where we sort of understand is where he made the big money, which is he invested in mining. And here he is at the Amparo mine, which is in Mexico. It's near Guadalajara, to the west of Mexico City. And he's the second from the right there at one of the entrance to the mine shaft. And it was a particularly successful mine in the early 20th century. And so I haven't been able to figure out how long he had the investments there, but he died in 1916. And so during that period, those couple of decades, it was producing a huge amount of money. Although there was obviously the Mexican Revolution in 1910, there are always confusions. And I just need to point out before we move on from this, that actually it was the site of a very famous strike in 1926, which was after he was dead. So likely his investment was gone, which was led by the great Mexican muralist Siqueiros. And so it had a lot of sort of a celebrity moment later in its life. But by that time, he was gone. So he retired from the business and focused his life in Woodmere. He moved out from town permanently to Woodmere. And here he is with friends and family on the porch, part of which still exists, part of which doesn't. He had a complicated family time. He had married the first time. He had a son, Charles Jr. They had a very complicated relationship, a sad and complicated relationship all the way to the end. She died, and then curiously, he at the age of 68, he remarried, which is never, it always can cause some confusions in a family. He married a young lady who was half his age, and they had a son. The same year he died, in 1916. So, but aside from all of that, he turned to collecting, and that was his great passion. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on. So there were several people who were influential in his collecting, and it's just sort of useful to kind of do a quick review of who they were, because they were important in Philadelphia. So one was the portrait painter, the gentleman, this is he, the painter Albert Rosenthal, who painted the portrait of Smith that we saw. He was a painter and a collector and kind of an aesthete, and he studied at PAFA. So he was a big influence on Smith's collecting. And there were two others who were noted as having been influential in his life. And they both were important in Philadelphia collecting in the second half of the 19th century. They were both self-made men. This is Peter Schrem of Schrem's Brewery in Brewerytown. And he was very successful, had a collection of 19th century pictures, much like Smith's. And you can see there's a catalog of, oh, sorry, I already touched the thing. There's a catalog of his collection that was printed in 1901. And if you just look at the way the pictures are hanging on the wall, all one above the other, and just hang on to that image as we start to look at what happens at Woodmere. And there's Schrem sitting by a piano happily in his collection. And the other was a perhaps better known gentleman named Joseph Harrison, Jr. And Harrison was another gentleman from humble means, but made a tremendous fortune in the 19th century in that boom time in the United States. He was an engineer. He focused on locomotives, which obviously railroads were huge. So he invented certain things, certain techniques. I won't go into the details, but he ended up selling them, his inventions, to Baldwin Locomotive, and made his fortune at a relatively young age. And he decided to go off to Russia, of all places, in the mid-19th century, where he worked with Tsar Nicholas I to build the railroad from St. Petersburg to Moscow. So he was quite a gentleman. And he came back and he built this big house, which is on the 18th Street side of Rittenhouse Square. It's where the Penn Athletic Building is now, which was supposedly modeled on villas that he had seen in St. Petersburg, but although we don't know. But he was an important collector and a very well-educated collector. And he, for example, he bought a group of paintings that came out of Charles Wilson Peele's museum, the sort of the precursor to the Pennsylvania Academy, et cetera. So he had very sophisticated taste. And when he died in 1874, but his estate was sold when his widow died in 1912, and Knox is known to have bought a number of paintings out of that. So he had these various gentlemen who were kind of advising him and influencing him. So now, but he had to find a place to put it all. So let's take a moment and look at Woodmere itself. So this is a photograph, let me get the date. This is a photograph from about 1960 of the original house. And you can see it looks similar to what we have now, although the tower is shorter. This is sort of a classic Italianate tower that didn't go up quite as high. It was built for the Childs family. And it then went through other ownership. The Shepherd family owned it. They bought it in 1876. And they proceeded to add to it. So they built, this is a shot of about 1905. So, but they built the extra 2 stories onto the tower. So if we can see, oops, there we go. I'll go back. Look at the tower now, and now look at it. There's an extra stone story, and then the French mansard roof that was added on top for the extra icing. And they expanded it. And so he bought Woodmere, Smith bought Woodmere in 1898. So it was about the time that he was involved with the Mexican mining and making a fair amount of money out of that. So he was clearly looking to turn to collecting at that point. And there's some suggestions that he bought Woodmere because he needed a place to put all his paintings. So he gradually expanded it. You can see, I mean, there are various additions. There was the porte cochere that was put out the front. There was the first gallery building off to the left. And then in the back, you can see to the far left, you can see the other gallery building hiding back there, which he added over the course. I mean, he worked on it about 6 different times, so it goes on. So we're just going to take a look inside because it helps us understand his collecting taste. These are classic robber baron interiors. What was originally a sort of simple Italianate house has been elaborately remodeled over the course of the late 19th century. So we have layering of all sorts of fabrics and textures and heavy furniture in here. I mean, interesting, the there's an Eastlake sort of aesthetic movement sideboard on the left, and then way in the back, there's this funny Italianate, sort of Italian Renaissance revival, etc. So it's quite a collection. It's classic of the taste of the kind of gentleman that he was, like the other gentleman we were talking about. Self-made, very successful. They bought expensive furniture of this sort, which has, of course, now gone out of fashion. But it's just interesting to see the interiors. So another room, again, this kind of melange of all sorts of different things. A vast aesthetic movement bookcase on the left-hand side. On the left hand, the chair with the griffins is a kind of a neo-empire Pompeian miracle, and a lot of decorative art scattered around. He loved porcelain, so you can see porcelain all over. And this is an interesting photograph because he enclosed in the porch that is now gone because it's the gallery space. And so you can see in the back, you can see the exterior stone walls of the house. He enclosed it in to have other things happen there. And this shows a kind of a perfect Victorian combination of, well, let's see the row of chairs in the front where there's sort of wicker chairs that were right for porch and then upholstered furniture you'd think were inside. The Victorians didn't care. They mixed it all up. So, and all over the walls are various smaller works of art that he was collecting, prints and paintings. There's a sculpture sitting on the pool table to the left. There in the far right corner, there's a case, a glass case that looks as if it has stuffed birds displayed. And then in the middle in the back, you see there's that kind of round shaped thing. Those are interesting. They're display cabinets of some sort where he hung pieces of lace on there and they fan out so you can look at the different pieces of lace. It was a kind of a 19th century technique, well, 18th century as well. You can see it at the Soane Museum in London. And so they hung pieces, all sorts of different pieces of lace, and then they could close it up and they put a fabric over it. So shows his eclectic collecting taste, but was also in some ways characteristic because everything he was collecting, although lace is slightly unusual, but everything else, the stuffed birds, etc., were characteristic of gentlemen of his time. So we now start getting into some of the gallery spaces. So this is a photograph of I think the first gallery built, and it's a top lit specially for his paintings. And now you can see how they're hung. That the way they're hung from floor to ceiling. You can also see in the back right corner, on a table, there's what appears to be a copy of the famous sculpture by the Italian artist Canova of the Three Graces, which is, I think, in Rome. But anyway, so it was popular to have copies. So, but I'm just to say, why the hang? What was he thinking about in the way he hung the pictures? So this is looking back. This is a print from the 18th century at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and they had. So I think probably many of you people have been to the Royal Academy in London. It's on Piccadilly, in new headquarters. But they would have these summer exhibitions, which were famous. And so they'd ask different artists to submit, and it was a way for artists to market their work. And of course, everybody wanted to be in it. So they ran out of space, so they had to go up the walls. So this is a kind of a classic referred to as salon hang. It goes back farther in European history. You can see into the 18th century, but this just shows you what he probably was thinking about. And this type of hang was also popular around in other cities of the United States. So this is actually a print from 1884, so a little bit earlier than what he was doing, but of William Kissam Vanderbilt's house on Fifth Avenue in New York, designed by the famous architect Richard Morris Hunt. And so you can see, here are all his gentleman friends observing what's going on, but there it is, the classic salon hang, which is what clearly Smith wanted for his collection. And so here we have a view in the gallery. This is it's a series of shots pasted together. And you can see that there's the porcelain vase in the front, and there's some sculpture in the far left. So the mixture of different media. So it's curious to look at these. You can also see he had electric lights, you see up at the top, which he installed in the late 19th, early 20th century. But so a mixture of paintings of all different kinds. It's hard to try and find and identify which one's in these photographs, but there was his taste. So, and then of course he built the big gallery that we all know in the back, which was interesting because it's quite a simple structure in terms of architectural design, but he stuck with his salon hang 2 stories high. So it's quite an impressive room, and then fascinating to look across on the floor down there, because you can see in the sort of lower right there these great trophy porcelain vases, 19th century, that were made. If you think of what was on view in the cases at the Centennial Exposition, they are exactly that type. Big, fancy, showy items, which are not seen that much anymore. And then in the sort of lower left, there's mixed in are pieces of sculpture, all on pedestals, on high pedestals, which makes one nervous if anybody goes in there and knocks things over. But so you can see the way he liked to present his collection, as I said, characteristic of his time. So we're going to now look at what he had, what made up his collection, because we don't get to see most of it because there's so much else going on, which is wonderful at Woodmere, but it's just interesting to see what he was focusing on. So, oops, what happened there? Something happened to that. Oops. Well, I don't know what happened to that slide. It's supposed to say, oops, it doesn't say that. I think it's, for the first one is it says 18th century English portraits, something that was very popular with the tycoons of the robber baron age, partly because they were trying to sort of pretend that they went back to the aristocratic England, even though they didn't, but they wanted to have that style. The second actually says, I think it says European and English and European academic paintings. So American collectors tended to collect European painters. They were trained in European art institutes, because in the United States, I think PAFA was amongst the first that was created, but it took a while for professional artists to get trained to the point at which they were being collected. So people tended to look to either American artists who were trained abroad or European artists that they could buy. And then genre paintings is another popular. Genre means it's a scene of something that's going on. And then landscape painting, marine scenes, and then going, as American artists got more sophisticated and better trained, and the market developed here for the sale of those paintings, we got into Hudson River landscapes and more local landscapes, and still life's always popular, and then sculpture and decorative art. So this was a characteristic sort of classic industrialist collection of that time. So let's look at just a few examples of each. So this is the famous Sir Thomas Lawrence, which is the portrait is in the back of his own portrait of Mrs. John Julius Angerstein. And this is painted around 1790 from the way she's dressed and her hair. So the Angersteins were a rich and influential London couple who were involved with a number of important painters, including Sir Thomas Lawrence and Benjamin West. And so this is a classic painting of its genre, full length, very impressive with its clothing, etc. In the back, you see the little ship. That may be a reference, the ship on the sea, reference to where their money came from. So in the classic portraiture genre, and a kind of characteristic of the kind of portraits, and you can see exactly these same things if you go to the Frick, for example, in New York. Many of the big collectors collected exactly these. So it was good that he had one. So then we get into to history paintings. This is one that he likely got from Harrison. It's Benjamin West. Benjamin West was an American artist who grew up in, I guess, Springfield, Pennsylvania, but then went and lived and studied in Europe. And he was a huge success over there. And he became the president of the Royal Academy. We were looking earlier at the hang of the Royal Academy in London, but he became the president, which was very unusual at that time to have an American. We were considered crass colonials. So to have an American that was important enough artist and also well connected enough to become the head of the Royal Academy. So this is a painting. It's called The Fatal Wounding of Sir Philip Sidney, painted in 1806. So again, a classic example of 19th century history painting. Sir Philip Sidney, better known as the poet, the Renaissance poet or Elizabethan poet, but he was killed in a battle in the Netherlands, and so this is showing him in that. I won't go into the details, but you can read about it when you go to the Woodmere website. So, but again, an example. And then here, another, I'm not going to dwell on this one, but many of these collectors, they loved these type of narrative scenes where something was happening. It could be historical, it could be just sentimental. And having worked at Christie's for years, we would always call these cardinals and cavaliers, because so often there's a cardinal or a cavalier in one of these paintings. And so in this case, there is maybe not a cardinal, but at least a priest, I guess, sitting in the front. And it's Christopher Columbus, and it's painted in 1874 by Johann Geyer, and it's Columbus and the Egg. And so if you're going to all have to now research, write this down, Columbus and the Egg, if you don't know the story. It's a famous story of Christopher Columbus proving he was smarter than everybody else, and there's an egg on the table. So this is, again, a classic kind of scene that a collector like Knox would have. So wonderful to see. Another history painting, the third one, because history could include the Renaissance, as we saw. It could include famous battles of the Napoleonic era or earlier. In this case, it's a biblical scene. So this is Thomas Buchanan Reed, an American painter who traveled a lot in Europe. So you'll see that at this point that in the 19th century, as I said, many of these painters had to go to Europe, whether they studied at ateliers or academies in Europe, or whether they just had to go to see the history of painting, because there just wasn't a whole lot. Remember, this is sort of pre-museums when this was going on. So this is Jephthah's daughter. And so again, I'm not going to go into the whole story of what the biblical story of what happened with poor Jephthah, or actually his poor daughter who got sacrificed for one reason or another. So, but you can look that up. So this is 1853. So another classic example of American genre painting based on mythological or biblical scenes. So we switch into a slightly different type of painting, but again, characteristic of the time. This is from 1886. It's a German artist named Gabriele Schackengiel. Schackengiel is called Sweet Reflection. So here we have a beautiful young woman who's all dressed up to the nines, and she's admiring herself in the mirror. I think it's interesting that Woodmere just uses the term confectionery realism, because I think that works well for here. It was a beautiful woman, because who doesn't love a beautiful woman? But there's something slightly odd about her looking at herself, but it shows the fabrics and the feathers and the flowers, and so it was a characteristic 19th century painting. And interestingly, Schackengiel was the court painter to Ludwig II of Bavaria. So I had to show you this. Here was Mad Ludwig Bavaria. So this is the kind of thing he might have had. This is the portrait is by the same artist of him. He was a great patron of Wagner, and he built Neuschwanstein, where many of you may have been, which was built and completed at exactly the same time as we're talking about. So just an interesting connection that I find. Connections with Germany are interesting, because in the 19th century, Germany was such an important country, and culturally, politically, in terms of education and research, and so much of that was wiped out by the wars, and that Germany kind of got written off by all of us for good reason. So it is interesting to see the importance of Germany in the 19th century in some of these places. So anyway, so landscape painting. So there are a number of landscape paintings in the collection. This is William Louis Sontag, an American painter who's traveled abroad again, spent time in Italy. This is called A Dream of Italy. It's not dated, but this is classic sort of first half of the 19th century type, where where you couldn't just, they somehow didn't believe that you wanted to have a landscape, and I could explain why, but anyway, just a landscape. So you had to add, there had to be some meaning, there had to be a message. And so here we have a ruined temple and various folks wandering about down below in the ruins. And this is, he was looking back at 17th century French, Poussin, Claude Lorrain, the great painters of the French Academy of the 17th century. And he was also looking to 17th century Dutch, golden age of painting, such as Cuyp, what they call Italianate. And so this was, so there's meaning I could go into, or you could see on the website, but so, you know, there's, whoops, wait, happened? I was looking for something here. That's what I was going to try and find. Oh, it's called The Spirit of Peace. So there was the spirit of war and the spirit of peace, and apparently this was a reaction to the the war for Mexico when we conquered Mexico in 1845. So he was making a reference to peace. And interestingly, down in the lower left-hand corner, there's a shepherd with sheep, which is supposedly a reference to Christianity coming to the Roman world to bring peace. So, but then other artists didn't use, they got kind of used to not necessarily having to have all that narrative in there and all those figures. So here's another, oh, I think you know what, I gave you the wrong artist for the previous one. I turned the pages. The previous one was Cropsey, sorry, who studied under Thomas Cole. Anyway, called The Spirit of Peace. So sorry, I was eliding two paintings together. So this is Sontag, The Dream of Italy. But I think that my point before about the kind of golden light, which is a classic 17th century French and Italian and Dutch image. And so here it's just interesting to try and identify what is that building in the middle, because it looks, I think it might be based on the Erechtheum, which is on the on the Acropolis in Athens, because to the right there's that thing that looks like the Porch of the Ladies. So people may know that, but anyway. So classic 19th century. So we go on because you can move around, and there were endless of these, both made and you know, selected by Smith. So this is Andrew Melrose. This is Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, but we still have a few peasants, happy peasants at a well, rounding around there. So you could have city scenes. This is Hermann Herzog along the canal in Venice. He was German, but moved here. So you didn't always have to have a countryside. You could have city, but you would have some people in the front, giving it a narrative quality. So again, characteristic of a 19th century collector. And then you could have marine paintings, which were very popular in the 19th century. So this is one by Franklin Briscoe. It's called Off Dieppe, again, a 19th century, but looking back to Dutch 17th century ship painting. All of these paintings tended to have certain allegorical meaning. And so there might have been something about this politically, where you see the rough seas, the people looking out slightly nervously, is that boat going to make it? That these paintings often had these sub-stories in them, which were important to the meaning, and sometimes very hard to navigate or to try and remember now. There was a great exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum about 7 years ago. It was on still life painting, where he went in and he talked about, you know, all the political things that you can find in a group of flowers. So we'll look at one of those later. But so a classic example, you could also have American painters. So this is actually Thomas Birch, the famous Thomas Birch. It's called On the Rocky Coast. He was English, but came and worked mostly here. He published a famous series of views. It was called Birch's Views of Philadelphia, 1800, which are used in architectural history to document buildings in Philadelphia, that many of which are gone. So he's partly best known for that, but he also does these marine paintings. So this is a classic again. Is there some allegorical meaning? Was there something at the time that it was painted? Is the ship in the back going to be flounder against the rocks? Look at that rock on the right-hand side, looking rather ominous, like a shark coming up. But then you see the sunlight coming through. Does that mean that the storm is passing? Might the ship survive? You know, these references to passing wars, to the dangers that people experienced. They all had subtexts, and it's just a matter of trying to piece out what they were. So another classic marine painting, and I just picked this one, it's by Edward Morin, it's called The Wreck. And again, we look at it and you think, oh, well, you know, it's a ship that's sort of falling apart. But probably when it was painted, this was at a specific time, and I just haven't had the time to do the research, a specific time and place where why did he paint a wrecked ship bobbing around? Was it that this was at the end of the Civil War? Was he making a reference to, you know, the naive innocence of our country that was so destroyed in the Civil War? You know, these paintings, they look rather sort of simple, but in fact they have layers of meaning. So another example. And then you can go to American scenes of American. So this is Frederick Edwin Church. It's one of the best paintings in the collection. He studied under Thomas Cole, Hudson River School painter. This is called Sunset in the Berkshire Hills in Massachusetts, so 1857. So what he's doing is he's taking that tradition of European painting, those sort of golden Italian evenings that we saw in paintings earlier, and bringing them to the United States. So again, instead of classical peasants or biblical figures at the bottom, now we have farmers and sheep, because that's what we have in our new country. That's what made us important. And so these are the golden light of showing the city on the hill, that the manifest destiny, what we had offered. So taking that tradition and shifting it here. Another one even closer to home. This is by Paul Weber, a German artist who spent most of the time in the US. It's called Chestnut Hill near Philadelphia. So I've spent a certain amount of time looking at this, and I don't know, Bill could probably tell you later, but trying to figure out where exactly is he thinking? Because there's a thing that confuses me, is that church spire up on the top of the hill. So anyway, it looks like it might be the Wissahickon, but anyway, you can all go to the website, and then when Woodmere's reopened, you can go see it in person and we can have a contest for guessing where it is. So just to wrap up with his collection, these still lives, these flower paintings, very, very popular in the 19th century. If you look at those photographs of the salon hang, you see a number of these. And again, on the one hand, they seem like, well, it's a bunch of flowers and some fruit. And on the other hand, they were quite masterful. I mean, the part of the challenge was, how did you have all the flowers blooming at exactly the same time? Sometimes they're flowers that bloom in totally different seasons. And you can see these are some of the red ones are poppies, and they would tend to wilt rather quickly once cut. So they are all allegories for a change and the passage of time, you know, the universal story of the flush of beauty being lost. And the same thing with the fruit at the bottom. And you could look at those peaches and think of anatomy, but we're going to move right on. So we're just going to touch just two examples of his sculptures. This is, of course, Abraham Lincoln by Sarah Fisher Ames. And it was one of a series that she did, and several are important collections in Washington. So, of course, he lived through the Civil War. He was a boy at that time, a young man. But the effect of the Civil War on the country just cannot be underestimated. And so therefore, Lincoln was such a hero, well, to everybody who wasn't a copperhead. And so it's characteristic that a collector like Smith would want to have a portrait bust of Lincoln. And then other types of 19th century sculpture, just one example, because this is by Hiram Powers, who is a very important 19th century neoclassical sculptor. This is called America. So here, just as the painters were looking back at European traditions, he was looking back at ancient Greek sculpture. And connecting the United States, of course, with the democracy of ancient Greece and the hope and promise of our country. And portraying America as this beautiful young woman with so much potential and sort of innocence right here. So I think a beautiful sculpture and one that is still in the collection, so which is great. Oh, why are these funny things there? Anyway, sorry, it's my fault, I'm sure. Something happened with my break pages. So we're going to go on to what happened when he died and after he died, after Smith died. So you've seen some of the collection. So we're going to look at this. So, so Smith, he died in 1916, and he had a rather complicated situation. He left the bulk of his estate to the Presbyterian Church, but he left the house and collection to become a museum. But he gave a certain amount of money. But then he gave his wife, his second wife, and his son by his first marriage, life rights to live in the house. So, remember the baby, the second son, was a tiny boy. So they stayed in the house. And it took quite a while, but finally, but the wife moved out, and Charles Jr., the son, died in 1936. So this is 20 years after Smith died. So the world had changed a lot. So at this point, there were no heirs to which this would go. So it had to be determined in Orphans Court. And so that's why I'm showing you City Hall. It's just a period photograph, which I thought was lovely with the Forest Theater. But so it went to Orphans Court to decide. So this was a long and important case in the history of state planning and museums. And it went from 1937 to 1939. So it went for several years, and there's lots of information about the deliberations that they made. So the challenge there. So here is what he said in his will. So it is my will and desire that the said premises, 9201 Germantown Avenue, together with my collection of paintings, antique rugs, statuary, vases, and objects of art, shall be converted into a public museum and art gallery to be known as the Woodmere Art Gallery, founded by Charles K. Smith, to be preserved and maintained for the free use, benefit, and enlightenment of the public as a contribution by me for the use and benefit of the community in which I have lived. So but the challenge was that there wasn't enough money that was left. So they assembled this whole series of dignitaries to get involved, because this is so important. So the president of PAFA, of the Pennsylvania Academy, the president of the Fairmount Art Association, the Art Club of Philadelphia, Temple, Penn, the Philadelphia Museum, which was, at that point, it had finished the new building, so it was more important. So anyway, and questions before the court. Oh, so again, for some reason, this is doing something to my pages, but anyway. So the challenge with the court was that he stipulated that he wanted to be a museum with his collection, but there was, and he bequested $200,000, which in 1916 may have been enough, but by the 20 years later, it was not enough. So was that enough to support what kind of museum? What would happen with the collection itself? Was it important enough to create a museum? So I think the words that are missing at the top are what's the plan, the best for the future of this museum. And all of the top things they seem to have been removed. Anyway, that's okay, we'll make it. So there were endless testimonies given. It went, as I said, it went on for several years. And so we missed whoever the first one is, but there were representatives of the Art League of Germantown, the Chestnut Hill Art Association, both gone. Various gentlemen from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, including Fisk Kimball, the famous director for decades, Johnny Stokes Sr. was head of the board, and then R. Sturgis Ingersoll, who was a big lawyer and was very important in this case. And I will just, when I talk about what he was proposing, I will say he was our great uncle. So I have to be careful what I say about it. But art history professors, and then of course Edith Emerson, who was Violet Oakley's partner and became the future director of Woodmere, and many others. And it went on, but in the end, the big questions that were put on the table. Here, there are two options. One, you could stay at Woodmere in association with the Art League of Germantown and Chestnut Hill Art Association, offering a varied collection, which we know his was, to the surrounding residents, but keeping the collection intact. And it's important to note that by 1937, 8, 9, we were in the swing of modernism, And this type of collection, of robber baron collection, had fallen out of favor. That 19th century academic painting was seen as old-fashioned. It was seen as the kind of Victorian things. Nobody wanted the dingy old Victorian furniture. They wanted to move on. So there was a certain amount of deliberation about what to do about that, because mixed in there are wonderful, wonderful works. There is no question, but there was a lot of sort of characteristic robber baron painting collecting of that time. We don't see many collections like that. If anybody's been to the Frick House, the original Frick in Pittsburgh, it is a similar to what Woodmere would have looked like. It's because it's unusual to have them survive. We've had Victorian period houses, but not with picture galleries associated. So the other option was to move the whole thing into Philadelphia, into the Philadelphia Museum of Art, to sell Woodmere itself, to create more money in the endowment, and then only hand-pick a selection of Smith's collection that would go into a dedicated gallery, which would follow the name, the Woodmere Art Gallery, by Charles Smith. And the rest would be either sold or distributed or put in storage. But so the advantage to this was that instead of having to go through all the mechanics of trying to create a whole new museum, that you could benefit from the Philadelphia Museum. And I think at this point, at the end of the 30s, Fitzkimball and Uncle Sturgis were working desperately to try and get art for the museum. They desperately wanted that Barnes collection. And so they were successful with a number of other collections. But so this is characteristic. They would want to take this collection, but they would cherry pick the best of it. But it would benefit from marketing and education and all those things that you wouldn't have to recreate, versus keeping it at Woodmere with the then determined inadequate $200,000 and do the best with what you have. As I said, some of it excellent, some of it out of fashion at that point, and then figure the whole thing out. So in the end, it was decided after, as I said, several years and endless testimony and discussions of finances and all sorts of things, the decision was to stay at Woodmere and to keep Smith's collection as is, as the core of the museum. Museums are always doing some things with their collections, but basically based on his collection. And then they were able to convince the dear old Presbyterian Church to give up some funding to help augment that $200,000. And the focus would be to serving the local community, serving everybody around here, as opposed to serving people in downtown Philadelphia, who they can come out to Woodmere, of course, but that the focus would be on the surrounding areas. So that's how we ended up. So I'm just going to I have a few more slides, and then I'm going to let you go. Wait, so the Woodmere Art Gallery was set up. So interesting to look, just 4 slides here of what did it look like when they opened the gallery in 1940. So these are shots of those same rooms that we looked at, and they've all been painted white. It's the impact of the colonial revival. They wanted to declutter everything. They wanted to make it fresh. They hung nice silk curtains instead of heavy brocade, and they recovered the furniture in nice bright silks. And there were still some large show pieces of porcelain. See one on the right there. But so I'll go through here, looking the other way, where you can see the famous Sir Thomas Lawrence. But they've kept some. I love in the middle that sofa there is a Belter sofa, one New York cabinet maker from the 19th century. It's kind of a Rococo revival, and most of those works were shipped to plantation houses in the South and then burned up in the Civil War. But this one survived here and has been recovered in tasteful mid-20th century silk. So here's the dining room. And the only thing that seems to remain from the original dining room is the table. They've added sort of tasteful Sheraton or Sheraton Revival chairs and sideboard, and taken out mostly to this fitted with modern taste. And that's the last of the inside. So this is that gallery, the porch space on the side, which we looked at before, that had the lace. And what do you do with the big old 19th century furniture? Well, you can put it on the porch. And so in the back, you can see there's a row of easels, because they were using this for painting classes. And so up at the top, you can see the lights up here, the modern lights being built. And this was probably a spotlight for the model. So interesting how Woodmere was adapting as it was moving into its new life as a museum. So I'm just gonna finish with just a few, just quick discussion of some of the newer. So again, for some reason, all of the first points have gone, but anyway, I think the newer areas of the collection, and I'm just gonna pick out a couple of my favorites. So the first one is Pennsylvania Impressionists, which was Edith Emerson's goal. The second is Arthur Carles, the great modernist, Artie Carles and his circle. Violet Oakley, there are lots of works by Violet Oakley. Social realism of the 1930s, the Hovenden and Corson collection, as in Abolition Hall, and then narrative art. So just to look at a few, this is Edward Redfield. It's called Late Afternoon, 1925. So classic Pennsylvania Impressionist. In this beautiful scene looking over the Delaware River, it's probably, you know, from New Hope to Lambertville or reversed. But you know, on a sunny winter day with lovely you know, houses at the bottom showing the hardworking Americans in a sort of dream of American landscape. But he was conscious of French Impressionist painting, because which often was quite nervous about the changes of the modern world. And so that even in these beautiful landscapes, and there you could see the French painting as well, of slightly earlier, that they would put signs of the modern world. So you can see in the back left, there's a railroad trestle bridge that's been cut through, and you can see where the cut is in the hill. And then up to farther to the left are the stone quarries. So in other words, the signs of industrial activities that in the midst of this bucolic vision. In other words, it's a slight tension of the world changing. So this is, I'll just get one example. This is by Thomas Hovenden. So Hovenden was an Irishman who studied in Paris, met Helen Corson, and came back and lived at the Corson family place out in Plymouth Meeting, including what is now the threatened Abolition Hall. So this is my plug for everybody do their best on that one. So they lived there, and again, classic 19th century. It's a historical scene. They're dressed in kind of, you know, cavalier type clothing, 17th century clothing, and there's some, but also classic, there's a narrative component. What's going on? What's he saying to her? What's she responding to? Victorian viewers loved all of that. So the Woodmere is blessed to have a group of Hovenden works and other of the family in the collection. So interesting to note, given the very local connection. And so this is Arthur Carles. This is one of his famous. Arthur Carles was a major early modernist of national reputation. He was born here. He went and studied in Europe. In Paris in the early 20th century, as you can see, he saw the Cubists, he saw Fauve, which is the sort of the bright colors, and was inspired by them. This is 1939, so he came back and he did his own versions. And so this is it's looking down at a flower vase, and on a table. It looks like it's going to fall over, but classic Artie Carles, the use of color and shapes, in his own version of sort of domesticated surrealism and cubism. And he was, as Bill will talk about, he was very important. He's taught at PAFA, and there are generations of artists that are inspired by him. And Woodmere has focused on his collecting. This is an earlier painting by Artie Carles, which I particularly love. This is back when he was more figurative, but it's such an amazing, the paint on the red hair, and then also the white, chalky white of her skin with the purple and green highlights. I mean, it's kind of mesmerizing. And there's something about the way her eye is looking. You don't know, she's not quite pleased perhaps with how beautiful she is. So he was looking, so who was he looking at? Because American artists going to Europe, it's an old story. So he was looking at Matisse on the left, The Woman in a Hat from 1905, but he was also looking, I think, at German and Russian artists. So there's something that suggests to me, this is Jawlensky, who was Russian but worked in Germany, the one in the middle. And then on the right, I just throw this in because this is the famous, it's a detail, it's not the full size of the painting, of the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer by Gustav Klimt. which is a mesmerizing painting, but there's something about the power of the woman in this beautiful setting. And in this case, you know, intelligent, thoughtful woman. So this, of course, sold and is now in the Neue Gallery in New York, so you can go see it when they reopen. But I also think, looking at this painting, I kept thinking there was something about the profile of her nose that just made me think of the famous Sargent portrait on the left-hand side. Just a detail, it's not the full, because it's a full-length portrait, which is the portrait of Madame X. It was painted in 1884, which was just when Smith was thinking about buying Woodmere. It was a portrait of Madame Gautreau. She was a famous courtesan or lady, society lady. It had a very scandalous reception. People felt that it was shocking. There's the whole business about the fact that the original had one of her dress straps falling off her shoulder, which seemed to be suggesting that she was getting undressed for the viewer. So Sargent hurriedly repainted that up. And so he was so upset at the reception that he kept it himself, and he finally sold it in 1916 to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I just put together this, because if you look at the profile of those noses and the white skin, I mean, they're different periods of time and different painterly techniques, but there's just something akin that makes me think that Artie Carles went to the Met to see that painting and came back and thought about it. So, and then another group are the Violet Oakley paintings. And so Violet Oakley is sort of the painter laureate, as people know, of this area. She lived in Mount Airy. And so this is the wonderful portrait by her life partner, Edith Emerson, who then became the director at Woodmere, a portrait of Violet Oakley herself in their dining room at Cogsley over on St. George's Road in Mount Airy. And so amazing, the pottery on the table, the bright colors. I think these colors, and I have no idea whether this is right, but it reminds me of Vanessa Bell, who was Virginia Woolf's sister, the Bloomsbury group, and Charleston, their house, that these bright colors and the simple way it's painted just suggests all of that. And also interesting, the connection, because of course, Edith Emerson and Violet Oakley were lovers, and Virginia Woolf, Vanessa's sister, was lovers with all sorts of various people. So, and in the back is the painting, Violet Oakley's own painting. It's called The Banquet, Il Convito, in which Emerson is dressed as her alter ego, who is named Giovanni, which is a boy's name. So of course, Virginia Woolf's great lover was Vita Sackville West, who also had names. So you just sort of, there are kind of cultural connections because they would have known about it. So a wonderful, wonderful painting. And then this, the second of the Violet Oakleys, then I'm almost done. Just a wonderful work on paper. And just to say that the Woodmere has digitized their Oakley holdings, of which are extensive, and many of them are drawings, and so, or charcoals. But don't overlook them just because they're not oil paintings, because some of them are really wonderful. And I just picked this one. It's untitled, but it's sort of referred to as Two Women. And I just think it's a classic example of Violet Oakley. She did these wonderful history paintings and, William Penn in the state capitol, et cetera, but she also did these domestic, it's a woman's perspective on life with these two women. So what's going on here? What are they thinking? It's the choice of the blue paper is wonderful because it gives it sort of an evening, a sort of slightly melancholy quality. And then the highlights with the pastel, the white pastel, are just amazing. And you just try and figure out what's their relationship. So you see the way their legs are sort of hitting at the bottom. Are they a couple, like Violet Oakley and Edith Emerson, or are they mother and daughter? It seems that the lady on the left is saying something, and the other one is looking at her, but there's a certain hesitation. And the lady on the left is far more sensual, that wonderful arm draped over the back of the chair, of the sofa. And then what's going on with the yellow and the red highlights? Is that sunlight coming through a closed window? Is that something light from the ceiling? But somehow she's the more succulent, the more emotional one, and she has the golden color added. It's just a mesmerizing drawing. And I just think an example of the fact that so many we shouldn't overlook drawings in their potential. And then I'm almost done. There's a whole group of social realist works. And so this is a wonderful one by Robert Riggs. With the stock market crash of 1929 and the Depression and the war years, many artists turned to, instead of fantasy images of Italian landscapes or history paintings, they turned to life now. And so here is a scene. It's called The Accident Ward. It was one of a small group of paintings that the artist did. It shows a man who seems to have gotten into an accident, and he's been brought in by the police, and they're observing him. So but with the black and white, the light coming from that big globe light above, and the faces of the policemen, it suddenly shifts tempo into a time in the United States which was tough. And in some ways reminiscent of what we're having now. And another scene, which I just love, by Robert Riggs. This is done at the corner of Chelton Avenue and Germantown Avenue. So I just thought nice to point out that we had local scenes, a busy, the sort of contrast of the busy rounded shapes at the bottom and the direct sort of lintel across at the top, and the black and white. It's a really wonderful, compelling scene of busy life at a complicated time. It's circa 1940, so it would have been the end of the Depression, but we were headed towards war. Europe was already in war. And there are also wonderful architectural scenes, and I can never give up on an architectural scene because that's my great interest. So this, of course, is City Hall by Hubert Pullinger, 1919. So just architecturally, we're looking on Market Street, we're looking east down at City Hall. And what you can see on the building on the left, the big hulking building on the left, is actually the old Pennsylvania station designed by Furness and Evans. Great Gothic revival building, sadly lost in the Penn Center revival. And it had an office building on the other side, the south side of Market Street, so they had this bridge that goes across. So the use of black and white, the lights, the way that the spotlight on the tower goes through the misty, smoky, sooty night, it's wonderful, these scenes. And another one by Pullinger, this one of the Baldwin locomotive work. So it's such a simple drawing, but yet so powerful, with these different the big black locomotive going up and the horizontal shapes on the top, and then these funny shafts of light coming in the back, like sort of divine light into St. Peter's or something, onto this industrial behemoth, which was Baldwin locomotive, sadly totally gone. So, and then I think is my last one, which is Albert Gold. It's just a wonderful lithograph. It's called Fight Crowd. He was inspired by George Bellows and Riggs, and he did a lot of scenes of boxers. And so here we are, that, this is so representative of its time, of the sort of gritty urban reality, painted in 1938. It's such a sort of dark time in the United States, of these gentlemen looking up at the fight, all with different reactions. Someone has his hand up to his mouth, and you just think they could be looking at a fight, they could be at a union demonstration, they could be at all sorts of things, but they, the sort of the pain and the struggling of people. You sometimes wonder how this COVID virus is going to affect artists. So anyway, so at this point, I am going to hand it over to Bill Valerio. And he is going to take over from me on Woodmere today. So off you go, Bill. You have to unmute yourself. Bill, unmute yourself. Bill? Bill? Why can't he hear us? Bill, you have to unmute yourself. Oh, wait there, hang on. Okay, hang on.
Am I unmuted now?
Oh, there you go. I'm sorry. It's all my fault.
Not at all. Well, I need to say thank you, George. That was mesmerizing and entertaining. And I'm happy to pick up on, what is Woodmere as a museum today, and talk a little bit about, as the director of the museum, how I view the collection and how it has evolved over time. I hope many of you have joined us on our Friday night jazz nights. They're probably not going to come back for a little while. These sorts of crowd intensive congregational kinds of experiences, but museums today are busy social places, and that has been my experience at Woodmere over these last 10 years. See it grow into the social museum that it is today, and successful museums across the country and around the world are having jazz, having classical music, having lectures, having hands-on art experiences happen in the galleries. I mean, the nature of museums, and George, you described it, in mentioning how are we going to come out of this stay home COVID-19 experience. I think museums are going to be very important because, there's a real thirst for hands-on creativity. There's a lot we can do on Zoom, and it's all good, but I feel that there's something real and creative that museums offer, and I hope that Woodmere can play that role in everybody's lives who's here tonight. Let's see if I guess I have to ask you to advance the slide for me, George. I appreciate it. George did a really beautiful job in describing Charles Knox Smith's collection. And when I think about Woodmere today, and one of the main activities of the museum, and that is nurturing and growing the collection. We're lucky to have a wonderful board of trustees that supports our ability to expand the collection. And I show on this slide 3 paintings, one of which belonged to Charles Knox Smith. That's the Berkshire sunset that George showed. And over the last 2 years, 2 paintings that to me are significant new additions to the collection, and additions that really help tie that Frederick Church painting into Philadelphia. Down below, you see the scene on the Delaware River. That's the port of Philadelphia, by an artist who was Frederick Church's best friend, the painter James Hamilton, who was lead marine painter of the middle decades of the 19th century, one of the leading artists of Philadelphia, and Frederick Church's best friend. They traveled together to the Arctic. They went on exhibitions together, travels together, but all of Frederick Church's connection to Philadelphia in many ways came through other artists, one of them being James Hamilton, or above the Hamilton, a painting by a figure in Philadelphia of the 19th century, Edmund Darch Lewis. And some of you probably know members of the Lewis family who still live in Philadelphia and live in Chestnut Hill today. Up above there is a painting by Darch Lewis from 1876, a beach scene from Rhode Island, but the tonalities are red, white, and blue. It's made for the centennial, which is the 100-year anniversary of the history of the nation. And again, Edmund Darch Lewis was the student, was mentored by Frederick Church. So a lot of what we think about as we grow the museum is, how do we expand the stories that important works of art in the collection tell? And so I'm showing you here 2 examples of ways that we've built on the collection over the last 10 years to make the art collection, the founding collection of the museum, given to us all by Charles Knox Smith. How do we make it better, and how do we make it tell that story in a better way? Next slide, please, George. And here is, and I hope many of you have had the chance to come to Woodmere, a painting that's an absolute masterpiece that I was able to buy for a song at an auction in a rural place in upstate New York. Sunset Over the Susquehanna by Edmund Darch Lewis, a painting from 1866, the year after the end of the Civil War. big salon painting that made a big splash in its time. It was understood to represent a turning of the page of the country. So the sunrise over the Susquehanna is a metaphor for, the country being reborn. And this is a large, 7-foot painting that is a real showstopper. And, I would say an acquisition I'm very proud of. But again, a painting that very much expands on, builds the story of where the museum was founded. Please come see it. It's one of those paintings that, and you're going to think I'm exaggerating here, but I often think, and people have said, the experience of a painting like Monet's Water Lilies, where light is traveling through water, there are reflections, there are refractions, there are clouds that are creating atmospheric effects with light. That's the mesmerizing effect of this painting. So it's got these wonderful things going on between, the actual substance of the painting, but, what it meant historically in its time. And for me, that's something that great works of art do. They tell you something about where they came from, but they also connect with you as an experience today. Next slide, please. After Charles Knox Smith, the person that did a lot of work to build Woodmere's collection was Edith Emerson, who was the director of the museum from 1942 to the time she retired in 1978. Edith is responsible for the several thousand works of art by Violet Oakley that we have at Woodmere, as well as works by artists in the school of Violet Oakley. And I'm showing Jessie Wilcox Smith's portraits of the Butcher family children. Some of you may have known them. They lived on Towanda. Edith Emerson was also friendly with the artists who are, the core group we know of as the Pennsylvania Impressionists. Among her very best friends is an artist named Walter Schofield, who lived in Chestnut Hill, or he lived in Chestnut Hill during a portion of the year, and he owned a castle in Cornwall in England, where he went in the summer. But that's a wonderful painting by Schofield that is probably painted in Chester County. I always describe it as a conversation between a road and a ditch. The ditch was made when the road was made. And I always feel that they, have a nice little duet there. But Schofield was a close friend of Edith's and very much her entree into that universe of Bucks County and Philadelphia painters that we know as the Pennsylvania Impressionists. And, Woodmere has one of the very great collections of Pennsylvania Impressionism. We show it, as frequently as we can, and it's a real crowd pleaser, and we're so happy to have these wonderful masterpieces. No, that's okay. It's okay. I'm showing a painting that George has showed already when I arrived at Woodmere 10 years ago. An artist who was glaringly absent from Woodmere was Arthur Carles, who is one of the very, as George said, one of the very important artists of 20th century American modernism. He also lived in Chestnut Hill. And so, here's a figure at the vortex of everything happening with modern art in Philadelphia. One of the important figures in American modernism who brought the European avant-garde, Fauvism, Cubism, Futurism back to the United States, was an important teacher. And, my feeling was we needed to bring Arthur Carles into Woodmere's collection. And so, I'm very proud that part of my legacy there will be having brought substantial works by Arthur Carles into the collection, including a recent gift from the estate of Perry and June Ottenberg, who are the great Carles collectors in Philadelphia, over 300 works by Arthur Carles that have recently come to Woodmere. We'll be doing an exhibition of that collection next year, and I hope everybody will come see it. Next slide. Carles was such an important teacher And that's in part how his legacy became so important through the works of his students. And I'm just here showing two works of art that we acquired at Woodmere in recent years. On the left, a painting by an artist named Abraham Ratner, who was a student of Carl's at PAFA. And Carl said to him, "Get the hell out of Philadelphia and go to Paris, and you'll learn all about everything that's in your soul to absorb." And you can see there that Ratner makes this portrait of a woman in a Cubist manner. He was part of the Cubist scene in Paris in the 1920s, came back to Philadelphia and eventually moved to New York. On the right, an artist that I hope some of you may know, a trustee at Woodmere, the artist Bill Scott, who's a leading abstract painter in Philadelphia today. The people who were Bill's teachers were Arthur Carls's students. People, of the generation of Abraham Ratner. He was never Bill's teacher, but you may know artists like Jane Piper, Keita Broadhead, Morris Blackburn. These were all Bill Scott's teachers. They were all Arthur Carls's students. And so, people we think of as leading figures in the arts today in Philadelphia have a lineage that goes back to Arthur Carl's. And I feel that that's an important story for us to tell at Woodmere, how the arts evolve from generation to generation, and what are the linkages between those generations. Next slide. And here's the work of a student of Bill Scott's, an artist named Mika Turin. It's a work of art that's hanging in the galleries right now, but nobody can see it. Mika is a young African-American artist. This is a portrait of her husband, Ben Passion, who's also a wonderful artist. And I wanted to make the point with it that, a big part of where we've been focused on, when Charles Knox Smith was buying art, he was buying the work of people who were living. He was buying work directly from artists in their studios. And, I believe that's an important activity for museums to engage with. It is how collections grow and become representative of their times as they proceed into the future. So again, interested in the connections from generation to generation. This is a young woman who's a wonderful artist, a student of a student of a student of Arthur Carl's. And I think you can see, if you think of that wonderful woman with the red hair in Woodmere's collection, which I'm also responsible for acquiring for Woodmere, and it's a great masterpiece. Think of that woman with the red hair and the green and purple skin. And, look how Mika Turin paints her pale white husband with white skin and a red nose and a purple cheek and a yellow ear and a green eyebrow. I mean, how can that not be coming out of the history of Arthur Carl's? So this is a painting that, hopefully one of these days you'll be able to come back and see in Woodmere's galleries. It's on view right now, but it's lonely. Let's go to the next slide. George spoke a great deal about social realism and realism in 19th century academic art. It seemed very important to me to bring Woodmere into contemporary times in terms of Philadelphia's tradition of realism. Arthur Carl's and the artists in his circle are the exceptions to the rule in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a conservative place. Artistically, we are the home of the academy, and realism is the mainstream of the arts in Philadelphia. I hope some of you saw recently the exhibition we offered of the artist Edith Neff, who is one of the leading realist painters of her time. This is a painting of the Hunting Park swimming pool. The pool, that little gazebo in the background with the green roof, still exists there. This is an artist who is seeking to capture the scenes of life as she sees them in front of her, very much building her paintings off of different photographs that she would take as she traveled through the city and composite those images together. So we've been very active in collecting the work of Philadelphia realism and the artists of today's generation. Next slide. And we've made it a priority to collect works by African-American artists as a museum dedicated to the artists of Philadelphia. It seemed 10 years ago when I arrived that we were sadly lacking, as most museum collections in our city are sadly lacking, in representation of the history of African-American artists in our city. We are a majority African-American city, although you wouldn't know it by looking at most of our museum collections. And I'm showing a wonderful, wonderful abstract painting by the artist Paul Keene, who was the first Black artist to be hired as a full-time, full professor by any of our city's great art schools. And he was hired in the early 1960s by the University of the Arts, back when it was the Philadelphia College of Art. And so I'm showing a wonderful abstract painting from the 60s by Paul Keene, another acquisition that I'm very proud of, and beautiful, beautiful abstract painting. Next slide. And thinking about African-American artists, we've done a lot of work to build the history of African-American artists. And that's nowhere more important than it is in Philadelphia, where one of probably the first African-American artist of American art comes from Philadelphia, and that's Moses Williams, who was born into slavery and in fact was owned by Charles Willson Peale. And I'm showing Woodmere's portrait of Elizabeth Tench. Great early Charles Willson Peale portrait with the spectacular bonnet. It's hard for us to imagine, but artists also owned slaves. And although Charles Willson Peale did give Moses Williams his freedom eventually, he was a slave owner. And Moses Williams was given a job by Charles Willson Peale working in his museum making silhouette portraits of Philadelphia citizens. And this is a beautiful example of Moses Williams' work, a silhouette portrait that would have been made by a machine called a physiognotrace, where a series of gears and arms would trace the profile of the portrait of the young woman. And then the artist would cut it out with scissors and razors and knives and put it up against a piece of paper of a contrasting color. And that's also an original, an late 18th century frame around the Moses Williams. So seeking to build the history of African-American art in Philadelphia has been a priority for us at Woodmere. Next slide. And here we are, Woodmere nestled in the Wissahickon, an aerial view of Woodmere. You see the tower, the Cook Gallery, our storage facility in the lower right there of the building complex. You can see the Morris Arboretum and its open spaces towards the right margin, Chestnut Hill College. Up in the distance there, you can see the great college buildings. But that we are sort of, what the experience of Woodmere and the experience that Charles Knox Smith wanted his fellow Philadelphians to have coming to Woodmere was to experience art in the context of nature. George talked about the Presbyterian Church as an anchor institution important in Charles Knox Smith's life. He was a real he was a dyed-in-the-wool Presbyterian who believed everyone found their own path to God. And when he wrote about art and talked about art, it was art as a path to God. And he believed that Woodmere could sort of bring people closer to God and bring people to a spiritual state by bringing art and nature together. I mean, that's a big reason that he collected Hudson River paintings and landscapes. He was interested in art and nature together. And I think I have maybe one more slide, or maybe two. And here's a sculpture that Scott helped us bring to Woodmere, Harry Bertoya's free interpretation of plant forms. What we've been doing at Woodmere, and I would say, the main biggest thrust of our strategic activities is moving Woodmere out into its landscape. to really think about Charles Knox Smith and this idea of art and nature together. And how do we express that in today's terms? And how do we use at Woodmere what is unique to us? We're the only museum in Philadelphia with 6 acres of beautiful outdoor space on the Wissahickon. And, you know, this is where we're going. We're going to be doing more stuff outside. And I think especially coming out of the COVID-19 experience, I think experiences outside will come back first. I think I can invite you all. I mean, lots of people have been coming to Woodmere to walk the grounds, to enjoy the sculpture, to photograph the sculpture. And, you know, as we come out of this, you know, we'll be thinking, you know, about our outdoor sculpture, you know, and self-guided tours of sculpture and all kinds of activities outside, probably a lot sooner than we're thinking about activities inside of the museum. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody. And, you know, with that, what I might do is just open it up. I don't know if people have been asking questions in the chat stream, or Scott, I don't know how you want to handle questions, but I mean, I'm very happy to answer questions. I'm sure that George is too, and we're happy to do our best here.
So yes.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you, George, and thank you, Bill, for a wonderful presentation. George, can you also make me the host again? In the meantime, we have a question from Paula. Any chance of bringing jazz back as a Zoom series? That would be for Bill.
Yeah, I can answer that. So the question, any thinking about bringing jazz back via Zoom? It may be Zoom. It may be, you know, it may be outdoor jazz with picnic blankets and, you know, things like that. But we're working on that.
That would be terrific. And then there's also a question about, can you speak a little bit more about the ideas for the grounds?
Sure. You know, during this COVID experience, we're bringing more sculpture to Woodmere's grounds. We are doing some sort of ecological art projects, like building stumperies and rot roads. We have a wonderful pollinator garden. And part of what we want to do is create experiences where the art speaks to nature and nature speaks to art.
What other quick questions we have here? We're sort of running a little long on time, but let me see if I can find some other questions. Lots of thank yous to both George and Bill. Will we have these lectures again? Well, we're going to try to smooth out the process, but depending on the COVID situation, we will certainly use this venue if we can. We do have our History in Motion event coming up in November, and hopefully by then we're back together. Is there a connection between the Morris family and the Woodmere history?
Yes, the Morrises and the Smiths knew each other, just as, you know, the Smiths and the Corsons knew each other and were friendly. And there are trees on Woodmere's grounds that were planted. They're mostly all dead now, but there were, you know, there are Morris Arboretum trees on Woodmere's grounds, and there was, you know, a shared, you know, Charles Knox Smith was passionate about art. That was his main interest. The Morrises were a horticultural type of a family. There was interaction, you know, crosswise in that way. So yes, they were estate neighbors. Woodmere used to go all the way over to Hillcrest, and it was in the course of the 20th century that property was sold along Hillcrest. So the, you know, the Morris property and the Smith property were neighbors. They were direct neighbors. They could, you know, borrow a cup of sugar kind of thing.
From Charlie, will this be online through Woodmere or Springfield Township Historical Society? So yes, it'll be online through the Historical Society, and we haven't had a conversation with Bill or his staff about posting it through their social media yet, but hopefully that can happen.
Yeah, we're glad to.
And And then I'm going to share, in closing, I'm going to share a photo here. There's a nice picture. So this is Harry Bertoya's free interpretation of plant forms that, as Bill mentioned, I had the opportunity to help bring to Woodmere. It had been in storage for, I think it was almost 20 years. Used to be down at the Philadelphia Convention Center. And recently, to acknowledge the first responders and our medical care providers, the Woodmere lit the sculpture up in blue, and I think that was a wonderful tribute. The other thing I would like to mention is if you go online now, while things are still closed, the staff has put together activities for children, which are wonderful. I had a chance to take a look at those. So everybody's still working behind the scenes, and if you go on Woodmere's site, you can access those. So once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. I think the turnout was terrific. And we'll see about doing another one of these, but hopefully we'll be back together really soon. So in the meantime, please stay safe and practice social distancing and wear your masks. So again, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I hope you have a good evening, what's left of it, and we will be together again real soon, I hope.
Okay.
Take care.